Welcome to Series 2 of the Lost in Language podcast, hosted by me, Jessica Ball. This series is a deep dive into Bohm Dialogue, a practice, process and philosophy that I have been passionately working with for the past 10 years. Driven by his deep interest in human nature, David Bohm brought people together in dialogue to explore aspects of human consciousness at the individual, collective and cosmic level. In this episode, I talked to Jonny Drury. Jonny is a dialogue facilitator, trainer, consultant and therapeutic consultant. He specialises in autism, neurodiversity and regenerative approaches to combat systemic trauma and fragmentation of consciousness, aiming to empower clients to embrace their uniqueness. This year, he is launching his book, The Autism Dialogue Approach. This conversation takes us on a journey through Jonny's life, from his experiences as a child to discovering psychedelics and Sufism, his introduction to Bohm Dialogue during his fine art degree, and being diagnosed with autism and ADHD in later life. Jonny shares how Bohm's philosophy of wholeness, mirrored in other spiritual traditions, helps us understand the neurodiversity paradigm as a subset of biodiversity, recognizing that everyone is different. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, Jonny, to the Lost in Language podcast. I'm really excited to have you here today as a guest on this series looking at dialogue and Bohm Dialogue. Before we dive in, let's check in with each other. It'd be really nice just to know how you're feeling today.
Yeah, I'm feeling good. As I said to you a few years ago, I realised I want to push back against this Monday morning thing, and it's basically my space day. You know, when I just have some time to think, and that for a lot of people that might be doing the accounts or preparing for the week ahead. I do a bit of that, but it's just a nice feeling to think that I'm in a minority, just being sat relaxed and maybe time for some creative thinking and doing things like this. So I'm feeling good.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I loved what you said about reclaiming Monday mornings. This is kind of creative space. And so it's really exciting that, yeah, this is how we're going to start our week, diving into dialogue and our practices. And yeah, equally feel really curious. I think, yeah, we shared a little bit of nervousness, I think, before we started recording, which is always, I think, an indication that we're stepping into a space of one, the unknown, but also something that feels important to us. And that's the nervousness sometimes I equate with just caring about things. So yeah, I think if we can go forward together with curiosity and openness and care for one another in our conversation today.
Definitely, I'm up for that.
Great. Okay, well, I would really love to start with your journey with dialogue. I know that you have a specific practice that incorporates people with autism. And so can you just share a little bit then about your journey, how you discovered dialogue, but also particularly Bohm dialogue, but I know we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other kind of theories and
Mm.
approaches that you've woven into your practice.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I tell this story quite a lot, and I've been working on my autobiography really for my own reasons, personal reasons, for a long time. Just documenting, and it does go back to when I was a kid. I remember being about 5 or 6, and I just having this distinct feeling that something wasn't being shown to me in the world that was there, but it wasn't being made explicit. It's like this sense of what are you presenting and what aren't you presenting to my family, society, school, everything, what's going on behind all this sort of thing. And then it was a bit of a chaotic journey as a teenager. Um, School was quite problematic, although I was really quite bright. Um, but I pushed back, and as soon as I discovered psychedelics, and I was about 15, that was like, okay, this is serious stuff about um, my existence, reality, and a whole new doors of perception opened, basically, so to speak. So I spent a few years doing psychedelics, and then came to an abrupt halt, um, and realized I was on the wrong path, and this wasn't going to do for me what I needed, which was I was starting to think about community and what are the deeper interconnected elements of life that I can access. That wasn't just I wasn't just being offered at all. I wasn't even being offered a work ethic when I think about it. So met a Sufi sheikh, Turkish Sufi master who was actually touring, came to Sheffield, my hometown, and I was given a leaflet in town and by somebody, this guy with a big beard and a turban and a red cloak, who's standing outside the town hall and gave me this flyer. And I knew a little bit about Sufism because I spent time in the library. Um, Looking at Sufism, Buddhism, astral projection, magic, all those sorts of things. And so I went along and I just fell in love straight away with this incredibly charismatic little man. And we met eyes. I said thank you to him, and he said thank you back to me. This was after a talk that he'd given, which I felt like he was speaking directly to me about only things I'd thought about and not shared with anyone. And it was all like pointing towards unity of being and my place in the universe. And just extremely briefly, I spent 20 years from then on following him. And I'm trying to link this into the question about dialogue, because even as you're asking it, I realized that some of those Sufi gatherings where we sit around chanting and communing and were probably when I started to realize that there is a method for merging with others in a safe and constructive way in a circle. There was talking involved, and I felt um, quite proud of myself to be able to, after a while, a year or two, to be able to welcome others into the circle who were coming into the city, into the centre there. And yeah, I don't know if I should pause there before I go on to the next chapter.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a magical story, and I guess what I'm
Mm.
seeing is this sort of young person, and as you get older, like a thirst for knowledge, but not just from like the library and the books, like you said, but also this direct like sensory perception and experience of life, and like how do we form knowledge through living our own lives, but this real openness and curiosity to being present with that, and yeah, these kind of opportunities that or experiences that fell or you sort of sort out in your life, and just if you're open to that, then places that it takes you and the experiences that you can have, and arriving in this kind of safe circle of unity just
Yeah,
it feels like a really magical story already.
yeah. They were magical years, and they Sufism is basically described as an esoteric dimension of Islam, but it's in a way that you can be compared to Taoism or other ways. I mean, there's this idea that everything points to unity of existence anyway, whatever path, and that's a wonderful thing to reflect on. But it gave me a kind of a framework, a way of life that I could follow, um, and perhaps with this promise of nirvana at the end of it, it was almost like a carrot and a donkey, really. But after 20 odd years of that came to an abrupt end as well. And um, it's almost like the scaffolding just collapsed, and I needed to go back and revisit my roots. And at that time, I joined the fine art degree at Sheffield Hallam, and my life completely changed during that. And in the third and final year, I was introduced to Bohm Dialogue, which was being brought into the curriculum by one of our mutual friends, Hester and Helen. And that for me, that was by far the most significant moment in that degree. And I had a we had a few sessions of dialogue somewhere in the basement in a building. Um, just that sense of wanting communion with others was still there. And in a way, I had to also replace what was missing because I didn't have the Sufi community anymore. But I was a bit disillusioned with all of that anyway. Um, but I did actually experience, at least on one occasion, something which was transcendent. And I think somebody else in the circle experienced it as well because we shared words about it afterwards. There was this sense of merging and intimacy. It was
Mm.
called, um, and actually, it felt like there was a bubble floating above the circle, which we were all part of. Can't describe it in any other way. It was like an almost out of body kind of experience. And I was like, okay, this is dialogue. This is what I want. I'm gonna see what I can do with this. As soon as I left uni, I started working with homeschool kids and refugees in the local gallery, putting my own like kind of like identity workshops together, which was a
Mm.
mishmash of almost pretending I was my own ideal fine art tutor. And yeah, and then the next chapter I started to unfold. I had some wonderful moments with kids working with youngsters in the gallery.
Mm.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Mm.
And what was the reaction from those young people that you were working with? How did were they able to sit in circle and be in dialogue and use their voice as well?
Yeah, it wasn't always in circle. Um, I think because I framed it as my workshops as I think I called it my sacred identity or something. It was
Mm.
all like self-discovery for kids. And I even went in schools and did it, and a lot of the teachers kind of didn't like me because I was like, the free artist educator just floating and inspiring all the kids and then leaving and with all the kids going, what was that? But but there were moments where I felt like there was a lot more potential with these
Mm.
children um, than they were being given credit for. Um, and I'd weave in a bit of mindfulness, and I even invented one or two of my own exercises. I always thought it was a bit dodgy doing that, but they were harmless, just creative imagination stuff, and they loved it. They
Mm.
absolutely lapped it up and opened up, and natural storytellers, the eyes lit up, and they didn't have all this kind of peer pressure and all this competitiveness that was budding in a few of them. It was just a
Mm.
time where we could all kind of harmonize together, and I think we were all surprised at how easy it was for them to do that.
Mm. Yeah, I find that. I think some people go in with a lot of kind of misconceptions about what type of person can do dialogue, but having done it in different settings with many different types of people, like it because it brings us back to something so natural about what it means to be human and tell stories and be creative and speak from our own experience. It's
Exactly.
natural. The only thing is the practice of listening that perhaps we need to improve on because we don't always practice our listening very well. And then becoming aware of our bodies more because sometimes we're also sort of somehow left our bodies in um on the roadside somewhere and forgot that we have this kind of physiological response when we're
Yeah.
communicating and experiencing. But I think the foundation of it is there in everyone and particularly the storytelling I find. And what I notice in a dialogue is when people are telling their personal stories, everyone is listening. Because story, like when when it's like a privilege to hear someone's personal story, and it draws people's attention in a very different way if someone's just giving like an opinion. So
Yeah,
I think that's really powerful in the dialogue.
yeah, yeah. Being your and the opportunity to be more your authentic self or explore.
Mm. Yeah, and it's so fascinating that your workshops were around, yeah, the sacred identity. And you talk in some of the work around selfhood in a dialogue practice and being and interbeing. Can you say a bit more about what that means for you in your practice? What is
Mm.
selfhood?
Well, the first time I read that word was um, in a book by Ariza Arista. What was it? I think it was actually called Selfhood. Um, and it there was a chapter that related to the desensitization of people in the modern world. Um, I don't have a lot of words to describe it because to me it seems so obvious um, that everyone is looking to be content in their body and in their life and get some level of satisfaction and self-love um, and that acknowledgement that you are unique and of course that means it has to come from others from the other to acknowledge you as a unique being and that's where the whole community comes into it to see
Mm.
myself as one of many.
Mm. And you talk about unity in diversity, and also I like the phrase unity in difference.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's not like we've talked about this kind of unified, cohesive whole that we might see in spiritual or quantum approaches, or even kind of ecological approaches, that we're all interconnected and interrelated and interdependent. But within that, there's this uniqueness that you just said, like wanting to be acknowledged as unique within that unity and seeing our difference as a strength, as a diversity, and we know what happens when we monoculture nature, when we monoculture crops, we draw all of the nutrients and health out of the soil. Whereas if we have a diversification of plants and other organic forms, we're creating a healthy soil that we can grow from. So I think we're seeing sometimes this kind of monoculturing of each other, that we all want to look the same, think the same, aspire to the same things.
right.
We have to fit a mold. And actually, these fitting the mold was something that came up in a dialogue I facilitated last week, and it really stuck with me. There was someone talking about hiring people and this line of, oh, they're not a good fit, they're not a good team fit. And it made me think of that we've created these kind of molds that we expect people to fit into, and you either fit the mold or you break the mold.
Yeah.
But actually, we are each of us our own unique mold in the world. Like there's only one of you, there's only one of me.
But do you
And
find it interesting that that actually manifests as individualism as well, in a strange, paradoxical way?
yeah, and I think that's, well, of course, everything exists between polarities. So we have individual and we have collective. And I think for me, like we've been talking about the unity in this diversity. So I think it's being able to hold, and that maybe that's where individualism falls down, is that, and because it's married with competitiveness and not collaboration. So it's kind
Yeah.
of what do we add to our individualism, like in terms of stories or narratives about what it means to be an individual, whereas when we're unique within a collective, we have some sense of responsibility or reciprocity with our community. And I think that's very much for me the power of being in dialogue, is being able to be acknowledged as unique, but understand that I'm part of this whole and interdependent with it or with them.
I think that. that is at the heart of the power of dialogue. I had a sense a year or two ago when we're in these micro communities, because I have to relate my work to wider social context. And I was trying to get my head around like what is it that actually happens, and I just had this sense of like a battery or a power cell, and and every and I don't know how batteries work, but it's like all the individual people come into this circle and we get our power replenished, our spiritual, if you like, and social power is replenished, and then each person goes back to their life and is able to hopefully um, just transmit a little bit of that into the world. But there's also something which intrigues me. I've thought a lot about, but um, and you have to be careful talking. It's quite easy to slip into spiritual jargon. But what happens on another level when everybody's together and everybody making that intention? What's happening in the here and now? Um, when people come together with this powerful intention to be together, what's happening on the macro in that moment before we all go back as individuals, because we are still operating within the societal context. And I think that relates to early on when I was introduced to dialogue. Um, I kind of had this idea that it would be incredible to have dialogue everywhere in cities, and being from a busy city, which eventually overwhelmed me with its monoculture and homogeneity. And um, so I live in the countryside now, and it's much better for my overall health. But I just had this vision that it'd be incredible if there were opportunities for dialogue. And then there's almost this like, why the heck isn't it part of society anyway?
Mm. Yeah, and I think some people would say that there were times when we would come together more in community and in circle, and that we've lost that. We've lost our shared spaces. Um, Everyone has got this sort of curse of busyness or just being distracted. So when do we really come together to talk about the things that are meaningful? And I think that's what I really got from your story about when you were young. It was like, you were saying that there's something more than this, something, the more than just the explicit, there's the implicit that David Bohm talks about. And those are our values and, our feelings. When do we really come together and talk about these kinds of really important things? And I think for some of us, like I find myself when I'm in a context of people just talking about quite superficial things, I begin to feel increasingly isolated from those conversations because they're not meaningful for me. And of course, sometimes it's nice to just gossip a bit or talk about, your holiday. But I think for me, without having spaces to come together and really talk and think and share about these kind of deep, meaningful things, it's like there's something so missing. And yeah, for people that haven't experienced that, I feel like there must be even kind of an unconscious longing for it.
For me, and I know you'll resonate. It's not just about talking, is it?
No, of course. And I think that's the thing. And you kind of also talk about therapeutic dialogue. So I wanted to talk about this with you because I think there's something so powerful about coming together and listening to others in your own healing process, because it is so much about listening and noticing and hearing these other perspectives and being able to integrate them into your own
Mm,
perspectives, into your own worldview, and allow some sort of small or big changes to occur because you're like, oh, that person feels the same way. So it could either be really validating when
yeah,
you're like, okay, I'm not alone in the way that I think or feel about this.
yeah,
But it can also be the opposite. It can be quite, I would say, gently confronting because, in a
mm,
dialogue, we don't confront one another. But just to hear something offered to the center and have that sort of challenge my own thinking or ideas or beliefs
Yeah. Well,
is really powerful. And not and without having to even
yeah.
have that conversation with that person, I'm just listening.
Yeah. Or even like questioning my own agenda of being there.
Mm,
And that can be a bit of a shock sometimes. Um, and I was thinking about literally just being together as well. And, I think that that example of indigenous communities, which I like to mention,
yeah.
um, how how in many communities the practice of just coming together to be together, and if there isn't anything to be said, then there's nothing to be said. But if there is, then say it. Uh,
Mm,
and sitting together in silence. I've been with a few Buddhist uh, people, communities lately, and extremely powerful. But I think that that point you make about when people chit chat is relates to my fear of the brash um, kind of quality of a lot of talk. Um, and I was feeling quite vulnerable at the end of this hour and a half small meditation group in a village hall nearby. It was lovely. And I started chatting with this chap over a cup of tea afterwards, and I almost felt myself tensing up, thinking that he was going to tell me something about, his gardening or his car or something, some kind of agenda stuff.
mm,
But I was so relieved and surprised that it wasn't, and he was still carrying that spirit of listening to each
mm.
other, listening to what's going on in the process, and still like, looking for this sense of unity.
When we come together in silence, or we come together with communication and dialogue that allows moments of silence,
Yeah,
that it's really when we can start to tune into ourselves more and listen to our own inner dialogue. And I did a dialogue once with some students, and I was kind of told before, well, they might not say anything. Like they were
yeah,
quite shy. I mean, they were, university students, but still quite shy. And we did so I framed the dialogue around deep time. So we did some kind of framing exercises, and of course they spoke in those, but when it came to sitting in circle together, and there weren't many of us, I think there was maybe 6 or 7, we I explained that we would just sit in circle and wait for the first person to feel moved to speak. And we sat for 20 minutes
mm,
in silence. And because I had said I'm prepared to sit in silence, so we sat for 20 minutes, and then I was like, okay, I'll break the silence now. And it was so interesting because their reflections from that were that sort of half of them said it was lovely just to be there together in silence and really relaxing.
yeah.
And then there were some that found it really, really difficult. Through that difficulty, they had these insights into their relationship to control. And so
Oh,
perhaps they should not always feel that they need to control their situation, and a little bit of like feeling into surrender.
wow.
And so it was so powerful. And then obviously, yeah, of course, to show that we're all having a different experience as
Yeah,
we are together in silence, and being able to share that afterwards
yeah.
is quite profound. Where would you like to take us next in this journey of your journey with dialogue?
Well, I think being asked and invited, I just want to acknowledge that again, um, to be able to share my story, and hopefully you'll and the listeners will get something out of it. Um, where shall I start? So I suppose just continuing that story,
Mm,
um, and bearing in mind the social angle and the spiritual as well, the alleviation of others' suffering. So that's what's been going on for me for quite a long time as well. I don't know if you call it altruistic or humanistic or whatever, but I've done little bits and bobs of counselling training and a coaching postgrad, and then um, I've been very entrepreneurial and I just started chucking it down here. So hopefully the noise won't disrupt. Um, and there was that time when I tried to take the dialogue um, in the artist education realm, tried to take that a bit further, setting up a co-op. That failed, and then a couple more little enterprises slightly related, and then another one where um, I invented a healthy chocolate spread, and it was phenomenally successful for about 6 months. I managed to raise a huge amount of money from investors and take it national. Um, but then the whole thing collapsed, and I was just really at the end of my tether with with wanting to know whether it was me or whether it was society. And I, I can easily blame society and get angry and say, well, sod this, I'm off to India, or just buckle down and all right, I'll just be a bus driver for the rest of my life. That was one of my long-standing jokes. Although, if I was going to be a Siddhartha style bus driver, that's, the ferryman thing, that would suit me fine. But it was starting to get me down and confused. And so around that time, someone suggested that I might have this thing called Asperger's and never heard of it. And I looked it up and did this online test, and I was coming out quite high, and I thought it was quite interesting. So I wrote a list of all the unusual things about myself. Really, just bearing in mind, I was trying to frame my search for belonging and selfhood in society, in our society. I think this is really important. Um, so there was this list and of things that kind of I found frustrating about myself. And then at the bottom there was like a third of the page which were things that were unusual that I quite liked about myself. Anyway, I took this off to my GP and he looked at it and he scratched his chin and he just referred me to the local autism service. So I think I spent about 6 hours in total, 3 different meetings, sat in this dimly lit grey room being asked all these questions. And then they gave me this letter saying you meet the criteria for autism spectrum, Asperger's it was still at that time, and ADHD. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. I was a bit upset that I was going to be stamped with this deficiency because it basically, it is largely still based on deficit. Um, and so I thought I better learn what it is. And I went off to uni, got a postgrad autism, and then postgrad in coaching. And at the same time, dialogue came back to me, and the words autism dialogue popped into my head. Okay, that could be a setting where I could explore it with others as well, and we could do it together, and maybe I could even get some work out of it, and I'd get people to chip in, and for my time, and facilitate some circles. Actually, somebody at the Autism Centre suggested I talk to Liz Milne, Professor Liz Milne at the psychology department in the Uni of Sheffield. She was coming to the end of a British Academy project, and she was really interested by my idea, so she hosted it. We hosted our first Autism Dialogue in September 2017. There's about a dozen people there, PhD researchers, autistic adults from the community, um, somebody from a local autism charity, and then I moved quite swiftly into the community, so hiring rooms in the town, and I'd been putting on gigs, so I knew how to organise events and do publicity and everything, and I just started experimenting with the idea of using Bohm Dialogue to explore autism. And I found it absolutely fascinating, really edgy, and sometimes like questionable for myself. Um, though this notion of like, am I just perpetuating the myth of a deficient self, etc., etc.
But I've learned so much from autistic people over the years and hundreds of different people that I've sat with. And the story's ongoing, it's an evolving construct. And we didn't even have the word until 1911, just over 100 years ago. And I'm sorry, I just realised I'm talking a lot because I'm quite animated. I'm writing a book for a major publisher now on this, and
Mm.
it's nearly done. And there's just so much of a thread going all the way back, and then bringing in the quantum with Bohm and all those the social
No,
thing.
I mean it's fascinating. It's interesting that you bring Bowman because obviously we know he was so fascinated about how thought works, how our thinking works.
Yeah,
And I don't know if he ever had any experiences in dialogue with people with autism, but and I imagine that he would also see them as just another valuable person in that dialogue. And sort of
yes,
talks to the little bit about, like you were saying, the framing of autism being mainly deficiency or you getting your diagnosis and being slightly, yeah, resistant to that label that you then have to potentially wear and what that means in other people's perception of it. So can you say a little bit about how you frame dialogue? Because I know that you talk about being against the rhetoric of tragedy, deficit, and medicalized models.
yeah,
Um, and that your aims are really raising like the status of autistic people and like unleashing their potential. So can you say a little bit more about, your, I guess, values or kind of vision
yeah.
as also, of course, an autistic person, but for other people with autism who don't want to be defined by one label?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem, the way we use names and categories quite readily and swiftly, and Bohm's advocating for the Rio mode with more emphasis on the verb, which is
Mm.
really interesting. I'm wondering if I can just read out something that I wrote. Would that
Yeah,
be all right?
of
Because
course.
rather than me using extra spoons, we call them units of energy, and it'll be easier for the listener as well, I think, at this point. So the the whole the whole aspect, the whole thing about wholeness and the implicate order, which was Bohm's major theory as a quantum scientist, it, it's it's obvious to me that it's all about what all the major spiritual traditions are pointing to. But it's from like a deterministic point of view, but not like it's it's like a new determinism. So he's pointing himself to the fact that there is unity of existence, and with his quantum physics and his science, he was able to prove that in a way. But the way that he talked about the theory that parts of a whole are in intimate interconnection such that they cannot exist independently of the whole or cannot be understood without reference to the whole, which is thus regarded as greater than the sum of its parts. Holism is often applied to mental states, language, and ecology, as you mentioned, and Bohm said, we are the environment. Um, and as I mentioned, we're increasingly familiar with notions in Eastern philosophy and sciences, such as neo-Advaita, we know it as non-duality, and in Sufism, there's Wahdatul Wujud, which is the unity of existence. Um, so Bohm's principles of the unfolding and enfolding of the wholeness and the implicate order. Um, it was determinism and scientific realism, but at the quantum level. So what has all this got to do with autism and neurodiversity? So wholeness helps us understand things like the neurodiversity paradigm, which is a subset of biodiversity. It basically means everyone's different. It's a category for describing all human minds. but some have similar traits. Okay, like flowers or types of bees, whatever. And they're not less than, they're just different, or there might be less of them than others. But wholeness helps us also to understand fragmentation of consciousness and societal breakdown, I think, and I think because Bohm was a pioneer and physicist, his theories go some way to appease the scientific minded, right? But it is useful. It's all very useful. It's all unfolding for us, this knowledge. So it's widely accepted that autism is a core aspect of the neurodiversity paradigm. And societal breakdown, which we see, that occurs when surface level or explicit divisions dominate consciousness and obscure the deeper interconnectedness that unites humanity. So autism, which often involves challenges in communication, social interaction, and perception, might be understood as a different way of accessing or processing the implicit order. Autistic people might perceive or experience reality in a manner that diverges from the neurotypical experience, possibly sensing connections or details that others do not. And then there's also autistic people have differences around time and cognition, which sometimes appears more fragmented or non-linear compared, and it's crucial, we're talking about relative terms, to neurotypical patterns. So that all this could provide insights into why autistics might struggle with or excel in certain tasks, and you get the spiky profile and savantism and all that kind of thing. And I think that depends on their alignment with the implicit orders, deeper patterns, and that alignment with the unfolding as well as the enfolding. So just to conclude that, I think with holism, we can inspire more inclusive education, promoting holistic strategies that help so-called neurodivergent people integrate their perspectives. And I think crucially, therapies and social policies that emphasize interconnectedness and shared human experience can foster mental health and societal harmony. And in this way, autism is an opportunity for us all, if we take that perspective. And Erin Manning, who I mentioned to, has said some fascinating things about autistic perception as well. And I'm starting to see this landscape where everything is interconnected, all of this information. So it's been 50 years or so in the process, but thankfully a publisher's taken me on to be able to put some of this down in writing, and even you asking the question and inviting me along has spurred me on a little bit further.
Yeah.
It's the work that's the important thing. And I mentioned I've been writing my autobiography for a long time, and I think that I tried to get that published, but a lot of that's now being woven into the work, and that I didn't anticipate that, but of course it's really useful. But I need help to be able, and I'm getting the help I need with structure and editing and everything to be able to frame it for the reader, and not just my introspection.
Yeah, and I think that there's something about the way that we can live our lives and draw from that knowledge that we accumulate, that wisdom that we accumulate through our experience, in such a way that we can offer it back as a gift to others to learn from and build onto. And so it makes sense that the sort of autobiographical aspects of your writing are weaving their way into the work of your writing and the work that you're offering back, because you can't separate the two. Like, you wouldn't be able to do the work you do without the experiences that you've had and the knowledge and wisdom that you've gained and the insights that you've gained on the way. But then going back to like the individualism versus the kind of individual within the collective, when we are faced with challenging times, we shouldn't have to do it alone. And I think that's the thing, that how do we come back into community that's supportive and holds us and allows us to grow and shares wisdom and knowledge, so that we don't feel that we're so alone when we're faced with a challenge in our lives.
Oh, absolutely. I get so much from being able to converse with people who are like-minded.
And also maybe different-minded, because going back to kind of the neurodiversity thing, and what, I don't know if anyone's defined what neurotypical is, because we could just question whether there is such a thing as neurotypical, or
Mm.
actually there's just a thing of dominant narrative ideas, culture that's held within systems of power. And
Yeah,
actually, whoever we are, if we don't willingly conform to that mainstream dominant way of being in the world, then we would be considered an outsider. Or and so it's that kind of separation that we've
yeah,
created in our systems that leaves some of us feeling not able to contribute
yeah,
our value and worth to the system, because that's
yeah,
not the system that we want to contribute to. We want to create a new system where
yeah.
everyone feels of value.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fully align with that because the way the Bohm said that, thought is the problem. Thought
Mm,
creates reality, and then says I didn't do it. That I think you pointed it out there when I said like-minded people, I realized that didn't feel right. It didn't sit right when I said it, and then you supported me by saying, yeah, and also different-minded people. So it's this something about this readiness to look for solutions that the brain does, uh,
mm,
which I think manifests on the macro and solutions or categories. We're meaning making together, and and we're doing it anyway, and that's what an active theory is. And but
mm,
if we can harness that and do participatory sense making, which is contained, and we have some kind of contract or agreement, it's co-designed, collaborative, pointing towards cohesion from the outset. That's where it gets interesting. I don't even know if there is a research model. There are some that claim to, like, yeah, I don't claim to know much about them, but um, I don't know. I don't know. In a sense, I think some of the Eastern philosophies would even go so far as to say everything is already whole, everything is already unfolding and unfolding. But
mm.
when we want to go into like alleviating suffering of our fellow persons, we have to think of it in social terms. So what are we dealing with? It's like we're surrounded by we can't escape them. So we've got this kind of like holistic perspective, but we have to work on a fragmented level.
We could ask ourselves if that's helpful, and I certainly don't think it's helpful that we constantly have an us and them, or like the enemy and the good guys narrative, because that is
Yeah,
what creates so much division,
yeah,
and it really allows us to dehumanize and separate ourselves from our fellow humans.
yeah,
um so coming back into the whole. But yeah, this sort of, I guess, like you were saying, that even when we want to then potentially become a bit more pragmatic in yeah, like creating change or alleviating suffering, we're operating at the fragmented level.
yeah,
I guess that's the bit. Well, I mean, that's what we do in dialogue, right? Because we come together, we know we're fragmented, we
yeah,
come together, and
yeah,
so maybe could you say a bit more then about the participatory sense making?
yeah,
And is that the thing that kind of allows us to create the cohesion and the coherence in that moment in time? But like we said at the beginning, that even in that moment in time, there might be this ripple effect in the fabric of like wider society from us coming together.
um, yeah. Well, I wasn't. I was more interested in Eastern philosophy because it readily points more towards unity of existence, and um, in my experience, that's always seemed what I needed. But in the last few years, and I met Dr. Hannah de Jager online good 6 years ago now, and a philosopher who's a pioneer of PSM and working with autism as well. And uh, this PSM has developed from enactivism. So enactive theory is a new kind of social science that argues that cognition arises through dynamic interaction between acting organism, so you could say a person or a cell, and its environment, and the environment is of that organism is brought about or enacted by the active exercise of that sensory motor process within that. So there's this sense that there's an interconnectedness with everything, okay? And so participatory sense making is an activism, but in the social domain. So Hannah and her colleague Ezekiel De Paulo for years have been taking this forward, and other people in their group, in their field, Elena Kafari, and I can't remember the names. It's all quite new to me. Anyway, the idea that the interaction process itself can take on a form of autonomy. And we see this in counseling. You hear sometimes counselors and therapists say the relationship is alive. That's what we can work with. So from the enactive perspective, PSM allows us to reframe the problem of social cognition to how meaning is generated and transformed in the interplay between the unfolding interaction process and the individuals engaged in it. So the notion of sense making in this realm becomes participatory sense making. The onus of social understanding thus moves us away from the individual only.
I got goosebumps when you said the relationship is alive, because it's that potential within us, but also between us.
Yeah.
And what is being communicated, not just verbally, but like on other levels, physically, emotionally. And I think when you can really feel that, whether it's just with one other person or within a group, it's really powerful. And like maybe sort of speaking to what you were saying about being in the dialogues in Sheffield, like these kind of transcendental experiences, something shifts in the energy and time. We talk about kairos time in a dialogue practice, this different experience of time. And when we talk about participatory consciousness, that we may be feeling like part of this collective consciousness in that space, and that it's flowing between us. Obviously, Bohm talks about meaning flowing between us. So it's this dynamic, alive, felt sense.
Exactly.
Between us, and how do we create that, and what do we do with it? I guess is the question.
You could take that as two questions. And I think that when you were talking then, it seemed to me that you immediately answered your own question, is that we need to do it. We need to do dialogue. When you set up a dialogue, you're setting up an opportunity for enactive processes to be activated. You're doing it, and it's something to do with intentionality or agency, and human things like trust. And I think, Bohm, there was no such thing as Bohm dialogue, as we know. I mean, that's a term that's just hung around, and you started to make me think about responsibility and facilitation, and the right of this kind of like this sensitive aspect of being responsible for bringing people together. And what right have we got to even do that? Yeah. And it was in my first little groups with kids where I felt I was maybe I'm playing God a bit too much here. That notion went through me and didn't hang around, but it's like, wow, what's the potential? And that's one of the questions that William Isaacs asks. And I heard he's the first one I heard say it. What is the potential yet to arise in this moment? And there's a sense of power, real sense of power, which obviously we have to be really self-aware not to abuse.
And power is something that I'm increasingly interested in and exploring. And yeah, it's almost like you've just kind of solidified that relationship by bringing in the question of responsibility. And yeah, who are we to bring people together in dialogue when there's so much potential that could be unleashed? And yeah, how then where does our responsibility end in terms of that power? Maybe there is a responsibility to make people aware that there are many different paradigms of power, and to be able to name and really recognize a power over paradigm, and maybe, like you're saying, some kind of collective agreement that that's not the systems and structures and expressions of power that we're aiming to replicate, that we want. And I would hope that by experiencing that collectiveness and that wholeness within a dialogue, you would immediately know that there's this power with, or power within, or power to, that we could work with, or even power through.
Yeah.
But unless we really like have a literacy of power, there is still, yeah, you're right. I think there's still a danger there.
Yeah. There's something to be said about, again, I'll just bring it back to us as organizers, facilitators, as instigators of this device. So there's the individual responsibility that we do our own work, and with integrity and congruence with whatever action we do. I'm also sensing, as you're speaking, the tension on a societal level, because again, whatever you set up, you've got to be aware of context. So if we go into an organization, and that's quite relatively simplistic, it might be, because it's already bounded with walls and then organizational remits and all that kind of thing, and a structure. But then this is the challenging stuff for me, is in the community, because the boundaries are often wild, but because they're not so well defined, you also get, within the context of a dialogue, sometimes some incredible personal breakthroughs.
Well, I would say, as well, there's two invitations. One, I'm thinking that we often say it's sort of anything facilitated, and like dialogue is an invitation. Um,
Yeah.
and then I want to invite you, because I'm conscious of our time together. Um, have we got to the end of the story, of your story? So we've got to your first Autism Dialogue in 2017, and then you've continued and you're writing your book. Is there anything else? Have we missed anything in your story with dialogue?
It's been amazing working with the Anna Freud Centre and the NHS recently on the National Autism Training Project, because although it doesn't explicitly have a dialogue as a practice, it's definitely ethically aligned. And and I've met so many professional healthcare workers that are open to change. A lot of them are surprised when they realised. I mean, I was when I started training, which is a trainer program, a big program, and we're starting to, if we can be so proud as to say, there is a culture shift emerging. But it's all about change within the individual and the carer rather than the patient or client or inmate, whatever context. So that program, it unfortunately finishes at the end of this year, but it's been amazing, and it's really given me an opportunity to work at least implicitly with dialogue and bring some of those skills, interaction skills, and that inquiry, nature of inquiry. Um, I'm doing some ongoing short workshops with therapists on the online events platform, and that's really good for me because I'm sensing that's unfolding as well. I've got mindfulness for autism, and that's I'm fascinated at how mindful awareness is crucial for good dialogue. And but I think it's the therapists and the coaches and the whole healing and helping paradigm, which is really interesting because most of the therapists that I train haven't had any autism training. So it's not surprising. But I'm loving being a kind of a disruptor and putting it back, saying, what autism training have you had? What do you know about neurodiversity paradigm? What are your feelings and thoughts about the fact that we're all really different? And if we're not in the therapy room, if we're not really aware of our own consciousness positionality, then are we sure that we're actually helping the client and patient? How do you know? Those kind of like they call it micro phenomenology, don't they? The philosophers. I like that word, but it's just another angle I've got to look at.
Yeah, I think it's really important, isn't it, that we talk about healing a lot, but what do we really mean by that? Like you said, in different contexts.
Yeah.
And yes, we need to really work on ourselves and our own personal development, but sometimes, yeah, the framing of this can be that there's something wrong with us, and that's not a very nice place to be in. Like, oh, there's something wrong with me, I need to change. But
Yeah.
to understand that this is just a natural process through life, like an animal shedding its skin, like, we change and transform all the time, and that can be done, that often arises through challenges like we spoke about, but that, yeah, I don't really know what I want to say there, but I just think if more people understood that there's no such thing as like perfection or right or healed, or that it's just a process, and that process needs to be broad enough to incorporate all types of people.
Yeah, and I think I'm just hovering over something I've got here about that this um, perception that's fundamental to everyone, awareness of how things relate to everything else in any given environment.
Mm,
And Manning refers to it as an interconnected ecology. And
mm,
autistic people have got this more, or let's not use the word autism for a moment. Some people have got a more inclined for the implicit, as I was saying earlier. So that's a perception that arises before subject or object. And that, I think you asked this question, what does that mean, autistic perception, forming of experience?
mm,
And she suggests that we consider an ecological politics that prioritizes movement and relationships over fixed categories, which can be polarizing, such as neurotypical versus neurodivergent, or human versus non-human, or even teacher and student. And dialogue can do that because it's a praxis in that it's about thinking and action and
mm,
constantly looking at that dynamic together.
mm. Yeah, moving and
Yeah,
movements and relationships. Yeah, that's what
yeah,
happens in a dialogue.
and I think that's how it does transform the world, at
Mm.
least in which in the world in which the practice is carried out in. But where does that stop and end? Where does me stop and end? And that goes back to the linguistic bodies of enactivism. So dialogue, everything's in dialogue anyway. We can say that, but then we have to qualify it.
Yeah, I think if we kind of say that dialogue is about the interconnectedness and interrelationship, then and that yeah, everything is whole and unified, whether we agree or disagree, then it's the quality of those relationships and the quality of that movement and how they enable that potential that we talked about to be unleashed and used hopefully for good. Although yeah, it's challenging to start then classifying things as good or bad. Maybe we should refrain from that language. But yeah,
I'm I'm all right with good and bad, actually. I always have been.
yeah. I mean, in a dialogue, we'd find out that people
Yeah.
saw that differently. But yeah,
Yeah.
and this is the paradox, right? That labels and categories and classifications can be useful, but
Yeah.
they can also be very limiting and divisive, and if they're not interrogated or inquired into, then they can lead to a lot of confusion or misunderstanding. So we constantly have to move between those two things in relationship with each other.
Yeah. And everything else. And isn't that a
Yeah,
fascinating place to be?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of time. I feel there's one term that you use that I still have some curiosity about. So I might just ask you one more question and then perhaps we can share a reflection each from our conversation together before we close.
Try me.
Okay, so we're looking at your website, saw you use the term autonomous cultures.
Mm.
Um, And I really wanted to know what you meant by that because I think I often use the term agency and like things like dialogue and creativity for me give people a lot of agency. Um,
Mm.
and to feel enacted, I guess, and activated and enabled in the world to
Yeah.
contribute to these relationships and this mycelium network that we're all part of. And so,
Mm.
I wanted to know if it was sort of similar or there was
Yeah.
something different.
Yeah. And I think that's that interesting tension again because we have, I've got a sense that this has to be done in steps, maybe not like in a linear fashion, but if you take the example of being gay, that used to be illegal. It was in the DSM-5 as well, only a few decades ago. So, and that's an autonomous culture, so to speak. It's a good comparison, I think, because autism and autistic people need an identity to begin with that empowers and strengthens rather than constrains and degrades, which is
Mm,
what the zeitgeist is at the moment. At the moment,
mm,
but as autistic people find their autonomous culture and find their allies and their friends, and there is good scientific proof that autistic people can relate to each other better than autistic and not, right? Some great work being done in that area, but there's a sense that as when that culture finds itself, then there's a sense of hope that it won't need to assert itself, and it'll somehow like all balance out.
I feel like there's a whole nother conversation about that because that's opened many more cans of worms for me in my thinking around what we're seeing now. And I think it's so true. There is a need for people to feel a sense of safety and empowerment in their community, however they identify as their community, because we do seek people that are like us. It's natural. Like we talked about like minds and different minds. We do gravitate towards that because there is so much potential in that as well, and energy. But then it's like you said, getting to the point where we don't need to assert ourselves or other ourselves from all these other beautiful sub parts of the whole that, you know, as Bohm might talk about them, or autonomous communities or cultures, and being able to bring those together. And you know, we say in nature, like that the points of like the borders between ecosystems are often the most like fertile. So it's sort of like, how do you bring those differences together and make sure that they feel empowered but not wishing to dominate?
So that's what the original idea for Autism Dialogue approach was. Not making an artificial culture, but actually creating microcultures where you've got not both autistic and not, and we did some experiments with that where we started off with everyone and then separated and then had different sessions with, you know, which camp are you in, and then brought us all back together and looked at how the boundaries changed. And I think there is a place for dialogues that are about autistic people finding their tribe, and I'm happy to help with that, and I've ran a few, but we have to be careful about that self-alienating tendency.
Wow, thank you so much. This has been such a rich conversation. I feel like I've really expanded my thinking in so many ways. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we close?
I'm going to start the advanced diploma in counselling next month for 2 years. So if anyone's listening who's on my course, be gentle with me, because I don't know what the hell's going to happen. But I'm really looking forward to embracing that paradigm and bringing my own stuff to it as well, and being able to call myself a counsellor.
Yeah, and I just think weaving so many threads together of all your experiences and ways of seeing the world. And I think when we really, allow ourselves to acknowledge those different threads and that sometimes seeming complexity of our own lives, we can start to see that in others, and we can start to be more gentle with each other. And I think that's really what it takes, is to really be able to focus on that relationship, and the quality and the potential that lies in our relationships requires things that we've been talking around about presence and awareness and mindfulness and slowing down and feeling a sense of responsibility.
I also would love to plug my book. It's not out yet. It's going to be called The Autism Dialogue Approach, subtitle, a new model for meaning making for neurodiversity and intersectionality, something like that.
Okay, when's it going to be out?
Well, it's probably not until the new year.
Okay, amazing. Well, I look forward to reading it.
Thanks so much for having me, Jessica. I feel like I want to hear more about you and your work, but maybe another time.
Another time, exactly. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Lost in Language podcast. If you would like further information on the guests and topics explored in this series, please visit creatingmeaning.club. Thanks for listening with us in our search to get to the meaning beyond the